He bought a Chinese girl at auction for $2. What he did next shocked everyone. The town of Redemption Gulch was a dust-choked lie, a sun-bleached stage for desperation, cruelty, and the soul-killing apathy of men chasing gold. At the back of the crowd, Isaac Thorne stood like a ghost, his face a mask of stone as he watched Corbin Hawthorne auction human souls. He saw the defiant eyes of the Chinese woman on the block, and in them the ghost of the daughter he couldn't save. That failure had hollowed him out, leaving him with nothing but a barren ranch and a silence that screamed. He had run from that scream for years, not today. The bidding stalled at a single insulting dollar. Going once, Hawthorne sneered, then a voice rough as gravel cut through the heat. $2. Isaac's voice. He'd just bought a life to save his own soul, and now he was in for a penny in for a pound. But what does a broken man do with a shattered soul in a town that wants them both dead? The town of Redemption Gulch was a lie spat onto the baked earth. It was a place bleached bone-white by a relentless sun, a splintered collection of false fronts and hollowed-out men. The air, thick with the grit of 1,000 heartbreaks, tasted of desperation, casual cruelty, and the soul-killing apathy of a people who had long ago traded their conscience for a whisper of gold. Isaac Ike Thorne rode into it a ghost, wearing the dust of his own desolate ranch. He wore silence like a shroud, his face a roadmap of losses he never spoke of. He hadn't come for redemption. He'd come for whiskey. But the town had other plans. A crowd was gathered in the main square, a tight knot of sweat-stained shirts and hungry eyes. They weren't watching a hanging. It was something worse. On a makeshift wooden block stood Corbin Hawthorne, the town's smiling parasite, his voice slick with false charm. "A fine piece of property, gentlemen," Hawthorne boomed, gesturing to a line of chained Chinese laborers, their bodies thin, their faces blank with exhaustion. Hard workers, everyone. Cheaper than a mule and half the trouble. Isaac's hand resting on the butt of his Colt tightened. This wasn't business. This was a violation that set his teeth on edge. He turned to leave to find the blessed oblivion at the bottom of a glass, but Hawthorne's voice cut through the heat again. And now for a special lot. A bit more refined. They pushed her forward. A girl, barely a woman, her clothes torn bruises like faint violets on her wrists. Shan Lin. He didn't know her name then. To him, she was just another soul being ground to dust by the gears of this merciless land. He saw the tremble in her hands, the dirt on her cheek. He saw a victim, and then she lifted her head. Her eyes met the crowd's leering gaze, and Isaac's breath caught in his throat. There was no plea in them, no surrender. They were full of a terrible burning fire. The same defiant fire he'd seen in his little daughter's eyes the day the fever finally claimed her, a fire that raged against the dying of the light. A ghost walked over his grave. "What am I bid for this little china doll?" Hawthorne sneered. "Let's start the bidding at $1. A ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. $1. The price of a shovel. Isaac felt the scream in his soul, the one he'd tried to drown in solitude for 5 years, begin to roar. He saw his wife's face pale and still. He saw his daughter's hand go limp in his. He had stood by then helpless. He had done nothing as everything he loved was ripped away. Not again. The words were a brand on his heart. 50 cents, a grimy prospector yelled. 75, another shot back. Hawthorne chuckled. $1. Do I hear $1 for this exotic flower? Isaac's world narrowed to the girl on the block and the ghost at his shoulder. The heat, the dust, the jeering faces, they all faded away. There was only the failure of his past and the choice of his present. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Hawthorne raised his gavel, his smile triumphant. Then a voice rough as gravel and torn from the very earth cut through the air. 2. Every head turned. The laughter died. Corbin Hawthorne's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as they found Isaac Thorne standing at the edge of the crowd, a man who looked like he'd just stepped out of his own tomb. Isaac walked forward, the crowd parting before him like a filthy tide. He slapped $2 silver onto Hawthorne's table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden stillness. He didn't look at the defeated fury in Hawthorne's eyes. He looked only at the girl. He took the coarse lead rope from a stunned guard. Its frayed edges bit into his palm. The reality of his actions crashed down upon him. He had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the territory and shackled himself to a complete stranger. He gave the rope a gentle tug. "Come on," he rasped. Without a word, she followed. He led her away from the auction block, away from the whispers and the hate-filled stares, walking into the bleeding light of the setting sun. He had bought a life for $2. Now he had to figure out what it was worth and how high a price he would have to pay to keep it. That first impossible choice has been made. A broken man, a defiant soul, and a town that sees them both as a threat. What do you think truly drove Isaac in that moment? Was it memory guilt or the flicker of a long-dead hope? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of a desperate gamble in a heartless land spoke to you, show your support by hitting that like button. Next time, the silence on Isaac's ranch will be broken by two haunted souls under one roof. Will they find solace, or will their ghosts tear each other apart? The ride to the ranch was a long, punishing silence. Isaac Thorne kept his horse at a steady walk, the dust rising in a pale shroud around them. He had cut the rope, but an invisible tether remained woven from duty guilt and a terrifying uncertainty. He could feel her presence behind him, a quiet, steady rhythm of footsteps on the hard-packed earth. He never looked back. To look back would be to acknowledge the sheer cliff-edge insanity of what he had done. What had he done? The question was a drumbeat in his skull, matching the plodding hoof-falls of his horse. His land wasn't far, but it felt a world away. It was a place tucked into the unforgiving folds of the foothills, a place of sharp rock and thirsty soil. As they crested the final rise, the ranch came into view, and for the first time, Isaac saw it through a stranger's eyes. It was a skeleton. The homestead, once proud, now sagged, its bones weary. The barn leaned as if tired of standing. The corrals were broken smiles of weathered timber. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb. He had the misfortune of living in a testament to all the ways a man could let a life fall to ruin, a slow surrender to rust and weeds and the ghosts that owned the quiet hours. He pointed a gloved hand, his voice a dry rasp. "There." He dismounted and led the horse toward the barn, the silence between them now filled with the lonely cry of the wind whistling through the eaves. He didn't know what to say, what to do. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his only conversations held with the ghosts in his head and the amber glow at the bottom of a bottle. He finished with the horse and walked to the porch where she stood waiting, small and still, against the vast empty landscape. She looked at the house, her eyes taking in the decay, but there was no judgment on her face, only a profound, unsettling stillness. "That room there," Isaac grunted, pushing the creaking door open and pointing down a short dark hallway. "It's yours." He didn't mention it had been his daughter's. He didn't need to. The air in the house was thick with memory, with the phantom scent of lavender soap and the lingering echo of a child's laughter. He watched her walk toward it, a slim, solitary figure disappearing into the shadows of his past. He retreated to the main room, to the familiar company of a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He drank, but the liquor offered no warmth, no escape. It only sharpened the edges of his failure. Later, in the dead of night, he thought he heard a sound from her room. A quiet, muffled sob quickly stifled. The sound of a soul breaking in the dark. He poured another drink, his knuckles white around the glass. He was a fool. What could he, a broken man, offer a shattered soul but a bigger, emptier cage? He drank until the ghosts went quiet, and the floorboards rose up to meet him. Dawn came not with hope, but with the sharp accusing light of another day to be endured. He woke with a pounding head and a mouth that tasted like regret. He expected to find her gone or huddled in her room broken. Instead, she was outside. He watched from the dirty window as she stood by the old dry well. She walked the perimeter of the house, her hands trailing along the splintered wood, her feet light on the dead earth. She was not a prisoner surveying her cell. She was a farmer surveying her field. She stopped at a spot where a thin line of stubborn green weeds clung to life, a place where groundwater must run close to the surface. She knelt her fingers digging into the soil, testing it. An hour later, when the sun was higher, he found the courage to step outside. He held out a piece of dry jerky and a tin cup of water. "You hungry?" The words felt clumsy, alien in his mouth. She looked at him, then at the offering. She gave a single, slow nod, her eyes conveying a gratitude that felt heavier than any words. She took them and retreated to the spot she had found, and she began to work. With a piece of scrap metal she'd found near the barn, she started to clear the rocks and weeds, her movements methodical, relentless. She was bringing life to a place he had long since surrendered to death. A part of him, the dark and wounded part, wanted to tell her to stop, to let the land lie barren as it was meant to. But the other part, the one he thought had died with his family, just watched. He watched as a lone rider appeared on the ridge overlooking his property, a man from the town. The rider didn't wave, didn't approach. He just sat on his horse, a dark silhouette against the sky, a silent, ominous reminder that they were not forgotten, that a debt had been incurred and a price would be paid. The rider eventually turned and disappeared. Isaac looked away from the ridge and back to Shan Lin. She hadn't seemed to notice her focus entirely on the small patch of earth she was claiming from the dead land. He had brought a stranger to his land of ghosts. He just didn't know if she was there to quiet them or to wake them all up for good. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by the calendar, but by the slow, miraculous unfurling of green against the tyranny of the brown earth. Shan Lin's garden was a stubborn act of defiance. It was a small patch of life, no bigger than a grave plot, but it was a vibrant, impossible green that drew the eye and held it. She had coaxed life from soil Isaac had long considered cursed. They were not just sprouts. They were a rebellion. A silent treaty had been drawn between them, its borders defined by the routines of survival. He would rise before dawn, the ghosts of his past, his only companions, and ride out to mend the endless miles of fence or search for the last of his half-wild cattle. He worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was blessedly empty. She would work in her garden, her small frame a constant, tireless presence against the vast, empty backdrop of the plains. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed to soothe the wounded land itself. The silence in the house had changed. It was no longer the tense, brittle silence of two strangers trapped in a cage. It had softened, becoming a shared space, a quiet understanding that required no words. He had stopped drinking himself into oblivion every night. The ghosts were still there, but their whispers were fainter now, often drowned out by the simple grounding sound of another person breathing under the same roof. One evening, he returned later than usual, bone-weary and coated in a thick layer of dust. As he approached the house, a scent reached him that stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the familiar smell of stale whiskey dust and decay. It was the scent of wild herbs and a savory broth, a smell so fundamentally alien to this tomb that for a moment he thought he had ridden to the wrong place. He pushed the door open. Shan Lin stood by the hearth stirring a small pot. On the rough-hewn table, 2 bowls were set. She had used vegetables from her garden and a rabbit he'd seen her snare with a clever silent trap the day before. She didn't speak. She simply gestured to the chair. He sat. He washed his hands in the basin she had filled with clean, warm water. He watched as she ladled the stew into his bowl. It was the first meal he hadn't prepared himself in 5 years. The first meal he would share with another living soul at this table. The house smelled like a home. He had forgotten what that was. He ate the warmth of the food spreading through him, chasing away a chill he hadn't realized had settled deep in his bones. It was more than just food. It was an offering, a truce, a quiet declaration that this was no longer just his tomb. It was their sanctuary. He looked up at her face softened by the firelight. "It's good," he said, the words feeling rough and inadequate. A small hesitant smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoots in her garden, but it transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the person who existed beneath the layers of pain and fear. It was a smile that made a man want to kill to protect it. That was when he saw them. 3 riders moving slowly, deliberately toward the house, not passing by, coming for them. In an instant, the warmth in the room vanished, replaced by an icy dread. Isaac was on his feet, his hand moving to the Colt at his hip in a single fluid motion. "Get away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The riders stopped a stone's throw from the porch. They were hard men, their faces arrogant, their holsters worn from use. They were Hawthorne's men. The one in the lead, a man with a cruel scar bisecting his eyebrow, leaned on his saddle horn, a smug sneer on his face. "Evenin' Thorne." The man drawled, his eyes flicking past Isaac to Shan Lin, who stood half hidden in the shadows of the room. "Enjoying your new livestock." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. "Hawthorne is a reasonable man," the rider continued, ignoring Isaac's cold fury. "He considers the $2 you spent a down payment. He's willing to buy back his property, at a profit to you, of course." Isaac stepped onto the porch, his body a solid wall between them and the house. "She's not for sale." The words were flat, final. The scar-faced man chuckled, a dry, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool. She's just a squaw. Is she worth dying for? Because Mr. Hawthorne always gets what he wants. This is your only friendly warning. Give her up, and you can go back to your bottle and your ghosts." Isaac's eyes were chips of flint. He saw not just these 3 thugs, but the sneering face of the auctioneer, the leering crowd, the entire rotten soul of a world that put a price on a human being. He thought of the small, hesitant smile that had lit up his kitchen just moments before. "You have till the count of 3 to get off my land," Isaac said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "I don't intend to count that high." The man's sneer faltered. He saw the truth in Isaac's eyes, not the drunken hermit the town knew, but a man pushed past his breaking point. A man with nothing left to lose. With a final venomous glare, he wheeled his horse around. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat, and the 3 of them galloped away, their departure a promise of future violence. Isaac stood on the porch, his hand still on his gun, until they were nothing but dust on the horizon. The fragile peace of the evening was shattered. The war had come to their door. He turned and saw Shan Lin standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her eyes fixed on him, held not fear, but a new, powerful resolve. The sprouts in her garden had taken root, and he knew with a terrifying certainty that he would water them with blood before he let anyone tear them out. The threat from Hawthorne's men settled over the ranch like a winter frost, killing the fragile warmth that had begun to grow. The days that followed were taut with a new shared tension. War was coming. They both knew it. The unspoken treaty of their shared solitude was replaced by a silent pact of mutual defense. Isaac spent the brittle, sunlit hours cleaning his weapons, his movements spare and economical. The smooth, oiled click of a rifle bolt was a language he understood far better than words. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a sentry, his eyes constantly scanning the high ridges, watching for the first sign of dust that would signal the end of their borrowed time. Shan Lin, in turn, prepared with a quiet, fierce intensity. She worked tirelessly in her garden, harvesting what she could. She smoked the rabbit meat, dried herbs, and filled every spare container with clean water from the deep well. She was preparing for a siege, her ancient knowledge of survival, a stark contrast to his modern tools of death. They were two poles of the same desperate magnet, pushing back against a world that wanted to crush them. The discovery came on a wind-whipped afternoon. She was clearing the stubborn, thorny brush near the collapsed remains of an old line shack at the far edge of the property, intending to expand her garden. Isaac watched from a distance, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He saw her stop, her hands stilling in the dirt. She knelt, her posture suddenly rigid. She was digging at something with a focused intensity. After a moment she rose, something small and dark clutched in her palm. She walked toward him, not with haste, but with a strange, solemn purpose. Her face was a pale, unreadable mask, but her eyes, when she finally stood before him, were black pools of memory and pain. She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was a small wooden toggle intricately carved in the shape of a crane. It was weathered by years in the earth, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It was not a piece of this land. It belonged to another world, a world of patient hands and quiet traditions. This, she said, her voice a near whisper. The single word was not a statement. It was an accusation. It was a question that demanded an answer he had spent 5 years avoiding. Isaac's gaze fell from the carved crane to the dark, rich earth clinging to her fingers. The same earth he walked on, slept on, cursed. The same earth that held a secret he had sworn to keep. The wind grew cold, carrying whispers he could no longer ignore. "You should sit down," he said, his voice hoarse. This land has a story." They sat on the porch as the sun began its slow, bloody retreat behind the mountains. He did not look at her. He looked out at the land, his land, and began to speak the words tasting like rust and old grief. "I wasn't the first one here," he began. "Before me, this plot belonged to the railroad, a grant for the spur line. Hawthorne took the contract to grade the pass. He brought in a crew from over the sea. Chinese men. They were promised good pay, a stake in the new world." He paused, the silence stretching heavy with what was to come. They were strong. They worked harder than any crew he'd had before. They carved a path through that mountain with nothing but hand tools and their own grit. When the job was done, Hawthorne owed them a fortune in wages, money he never intended to pay. Isaac finally turned to look at her, to make her see the ugliness of the truth. He hosted a celebration for them right here where this house now stands. He gave them whiskey and a hot meal. He called it a bonus for a job well done. His voice dropped, becoming a low, dead thing. It was a slaughter. He and his men shot them as they ate. Unarmed, unsuspecting, they buried them where they fell, in a long, unmarked trench. Shanlin's hand tightened around the small wooden crane, her knuckles white, but she made no sound. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. The town whispered about it. Isaac continued the confession, tearing from him now. They called this land haunted, cursed. No one would buy it. When I came here running from my own ghosts, I heard the story. I couldn't get it out of my head. So I bought the land, not to live on, but to stand guard. I thought if someone was here watching, then their graves wouldn't be forgotten, that they wouldn't be erased completely. He looked down at his own calloused hands. It was a fool's penance, a drunkard's vigil, until the day I saw you on that block. Now she understood, the haunted look in his eyes, the fierce, sudden violence of his bid, the way he looked at this land, not with love, but with a terrible binding duty. He wasn't her savior. He was the self-appointed keeper of her people's graves. She held up the small wooden crane, its wings poised for a flight they would never take. "My father," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "He carved birds for all the children in our village." The air grew still. The connection was no longer a ghost of the past. It was a living, breathing thing between them. This wasn't just his fight to atone for a crime he'd witnessed. It was her fight for the memory of her own blood. He had thought he was protecting her from Hawthorne. Now he knew the truth. Together, they were protecting the dead from being erased forever. And the real battle had only just begun. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. A low, mournful wind swept down from the mountains, carrying not the promise of rain, but the scent of ozone and violence. Inside the small homestead, the air was still and heavy, each tick of the old mantel clock, a countdown to a war they both knew was inevitable. They had prepared. They had waited. Now the waiting was over. Isaac saw the dust first a faint angry plume on the horizon growing steadily larger. It was not the lazy drift of a lone rider. It was the purposeful cloud of an approaching army. "He's here," Isaac said, his voice flat. He turned from the window, his Winchester rifle in one hand, a shotgun in the other. He looked at Shan Lin. She was standing by the hearth, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a cold, clear light. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but a small bundle of oily rags and a pouch of dried pungent herbs. "The wind blows toward the barn," she said, her voice steady. It was all the confirmation he needed. He nodded once. "Stay away from the doors. Keep low." The first shot was not a thunderous declaration of war, but a sharp, contemptuous crack. The window above the sink exploded inward, showering the floor with glittering shards of glass. The siege had begun. Isaac moved like a phantom through the house he knew so well, a ghost defending his own tomb. He became a creature of angles and instincts, the world shrinking to the space between a trigger and a target. He fired the shotgun through a side window, its roar a brutal answer to their attack, sending two of Hawthorne's men scrambling for cover. They were professionals, not just drunken thugs. They spread out flanking the house, their rifle fire a relentless hammering percussion that splintered the very bones of the homestead. Fire, reload, fire. The rhythm was a grim, familiar prayer. But they were too many. He was pinned down, a hornet's nest of bullets tearing through the walls around him, kicking up dust motes that danced like frantic spirits in the shafts of dim light. They were closing in on the back of the house, his blind spot. Desperation, cold and sharp, began to prick at him. That's when he smelled it. A thick, acrid smoke, unlike anything he had ever known, began to pour from the direction of the barn. It was a noxious, choking cloud, a wall of pure, blinding offense. He heard shouts of confusion from outside, followed by violent, racking coughs. Shan Lin. She had slipped out the root cellar exit during the first volley of gunfire, a wraith moving through the chaos, and set her strange herbal fire. She had not created a blaze to destroy, but a smokescreen to disorient. It was the opening he needed. He burst out the front door, roaring a challenge that was half fury, half grief. He moved through the choking haze, his Colts now in his hands, a whirlwind of calculated death. The battle was no longer a siege. It was a close, brutal, intimate brawl. A bullet tore through his shoulder, a hot, searing pain, but he barely felt it. He was fighting for the memory of his daughter, for the ghosts beneath his feet, for the quiet woman who had shown him that a life could still grow in dead land. Through the smoke, he saw him. Corbin Hawthorne, his fine coat stained with grime, his face a mask of incandescent rage. His men were scattered, coughing and blinded. The fight was down to them. Thorne Hawthorne screamed, raising his pistol. "You and your witch have cost me a fortune." They fired at the same time. Hawthorne's bullet went wide. Isaac's struck the pistol from Hawthorne's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. Isaac charged, tackling Hawthorne to the ground. They rolled in the dirt, a desperate, grunting struggle of fists and fury. Hawthorne was strong, fueled by greed and hate. He pulled a knife, its blade glinting wickedly.